Hello, welcome, welcome. So we'll go over some of this again. However, as you come in, if you will have an opportunity, I promise you, to have your own video on and to be able to talk with one another later in the program. But for now, and I'll explain why later, we're asking everybody to turn off their cameras as well as mute themselves, please. So as you come in, oh, hi, Joel. Hi, George. As you come in, if you would turn off your cameras and mute yourself, that would be great. Good morning, Mayor Sussman. Or good afternoon, I guess it's not morning. We're happy to have the Mayor of Buffalo Grove here with us today. We'll get started in a moment or two. We're just waiting for people to come to the meeting. Welcome, welcome to our program. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Heidi Graham, and I am president of the local League of Women Voters of Arlington Heights, Mount Prospect, Buffalo Grove. We also cover Prospect Heights, Elk Grove Village, and Wheeling. League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization whose mission is to encourage informed and active participation in government. Membership in our league is open to anyone, regardless of gender, age, race, ethnic group. Yes, women's in our name. We are 100 years old, even though I think we look pretty good. But we are open and welcoming to all genders. August 18th is going to mark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. I'd be remiss if I failed to recognize that anniversary. Additionally, today marks the 55th birthday of the Voting Rights Act. Our league and leagues across the country are just as committed today as we were 100 years ago, 55 years ago, to the rights of citizens to vote. Before we start, I want to just give a couple of housekeeping notes. First, as you come in, we are asking for right now that you turn off your cameras as well as mute yourself. So if you could just find, if you hover over your picture, there will be a little spot where you can say, stop my video. So we're asking you to go ahead and stop your video. This will allow us to highlight not just our featured speaker, Dr. Perry, but our two American Sign Language interpreters, Stacy Shine Stapleton and Patty Shore Caden. If you need the ASL interpreter, you can pin their video. We also ask that you send us a chat that you need that interpreter, so that when we, later in the program, when we put everybody into breakout rooms, we make sure to have you with that interpreter. The reason that we are asking you to turn off your cameras instead of doing it for you, because we certainly, as hosts of the meeting, if you've done any Zoom meetings, you know how this works. We could turn your cameras off, but then later on, you're not going to be able to turn it back on, and it becomes, it would really slow us down. So again, we're asking you to turn your cameras off as well as mute your microphones. Trust me, this is going to be the most efficient way. We ask that you use the chat for questions for our facilitator, Dr. Destiny Peary. We want everyone to be fully present for this particular presentation, and the chat can be such a huge distraction. So I'm going to ask you to refrain from using that chat except for pertinent questions. So let's not have sidebar conversations. I know that I've been in meetings before where I have been guilty of having my own little conversation and not necessarily paying attention. And we really want people to be able to pay attention tonight. You might want to grab a pencil, or if you're not old like me, a phone or a digital format to take some quick notes during tonight's program. Don't worry, I'm not grading anybody, but there'll be prizes at the end. I am really honored to be offering tonight's implicit bias training, a program that generally costs at least $50 to all of our communities for free. This was only made possible because of the commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion of Superintendent Michael Connolly and the School Board of Community Consolidated School District 21. We are grateful to the district for underwriting the cost of tonight's program and are excited for this new partnership between our league and District 21. Further, the support of the Buffalo Grove Community Trust allows us to offer this program interpreted into American Sign Language. And our goal is also to have, after the fact, the entire program interpreted into Spanish, Polish, and Russian. I make no promises on that, but that is our goal because we are also committed to DEI. But we always need financial support. We are a 100% volunteer organization. So if you're able to, I always encourage you to go to our website at www.lwvah.org and donate. Tonight's program is being led by an amazing woman, Dr. Destiny Peary. I met Dr. Peary last November when I was able to attend this same type of workshop, implicit bias training, offered by our partners, the Illinois Commission on Diversity and Human Relations. Dr. Peary is an independent diversity and research consultant, a former law professor at Duke University and Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. She obtained her BA in psychology from the University of Minnesota, an MA and PhD in social psychology from Northwestern University, as well as her JD from Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. She is an experienced researcher and a pragmatic thinker on issues of diversity, inclusion, and the intersection of race, social science, and law and policy. She has over 15 years of experience in conducting social science research, writing, teaching, and speaking publicly on diversity and inclusion related issues and participating in leading diversity and inclusion efforts, including conducting writing and speaking about research on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. All things that we are trying to combat here with our programs on Anger to Action. In short, Ms. Peary knows her stuff, and we are honored to have her here tonight. I'm going to go off my camera as well as go on mute. Thank you so much, Dr. Peary.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I wish I could see all of you right now. I will get to, I think a little later in the program, I'll get to see some of your faces. So Heidi came to me because she had been part of this program in the past. And she said that, you know, the League of Women Voters is really trying to put together a series of programs to engage in conversations that are critical to the current moment that we're in right now. So this program is really meant to give all of you a foundation for thinking about cognitive biases and the ways that they can interfere with how we perceive the world and others around us, and thus interfere with our goals for diversity, creating diversity and inclusion. So I will pause here to say, if you do have questions, again, feel free to drop them in the chat box, and you can send them directly to me, or you can send them to everyone. And we do have some time at the end for questions, but if there's a question that comes through that seems like it needs an immediate answer, then I will respond to it in as they come through. So just wanted to let you know that. Okay. So where I like to start when I start a conversation about bias, and particularly implicit bias, you may have heard that idea before, is to try to demonstrate the basic idea of what implicit bias is through a task that is very much like something we all do all of the time, which is we form impressions of other people. So this task, called First Impressions, is simply going to be a situation where you write down or think about your impressions of a series of photos that I show you. There will be 8 photos, and I will show them to you for a brief period of time. And I want you to think about, for each person, who is this person? What is this person like? And I will tell you when each photo changes. And then at the end, we will do a poll and we'll discuss how this is related to the idea of cognitive bias. So we'll get ourselves ready here. So there will be 8 photos in total, and I will signal when we are transitioning between photos. So here's our first person. Who is this person? What is this person like? New person. New person. New person. Who is this person? What is this person like? New person. New person. New person. And our final person. And you may recognize this person, but I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. So to start, what I'd like you to do, I'm going to launch a poll. And I want you to go through and click on the things that you found yourself paying attention to about the folks in the photos. So I'll give you all a moment to respond, and then we'll go from there. So we're at about 50% of you. Okay, so about 10, I'll give you 10 more seconds. Okay. So now I'm going to share the results. And I chose to put on here things that people typically do mention when I've done this exercise in person, and I just ask the room for what they paid attention to. And so you can see the variety of things, as well as the differences between the things that almost everybody is saying that they pay attention to and the things that many fewer people are saying. So for the things that most people are saying they pay attention to, the number one was facial expressions. So whether someone was smiling or not smiling, age, gender, race and ethnicity, clothing, occupation or job. So those are all things that a majority of people in this group were saying that they found themselves noticing about the people in the photos. A little less common, but still a good fraction of people, about a third in each case. Religion, ability or disability, skin color, and location. So where the people seem to be in the photos, and religion. So we didn't have any of these categories where people weren't paying any attention. Nobody was paying any attention to these things. So as I continue talking, if there are things that in addition to those that you see here, that you found yourself noticing and you want to share, feel free to drop those ideas into the chat. But one of the things I wanted to point out about this collection of characteristics or things that we can observe about others is that it really encompasses both physical things about the body. So for example, what my face looks like, what expression I have on my face, what color my skin is, what texture my hair has, what clothes I've chosen to put on my body. But there are other things that people were paying attention to that weren't necessarily about the person's per se. So maybe it was the context or the location that they were in, as well as more complex kind of compilations of characteristics like occupation. So for example, if you remember the black man sitting at the desk, I can say in a lot of prior presentations, people say, I think that guy looks like an IT guy. So they're putting together a group of characteristics and they're saying these characteristics come together and they create a picture of someone who I think fits this description of someone who's a quote IT guy. So if we had the chance to engage in person, this would be a little bit easier to pull out. But the point here is that there is a lot that we can draw from simply looking at a photo of another person. So I showed you each person for about 15 to 20 seconds, which we might feel like is not a lot of time. But if we're all being honest about whether this was easy or difficult, we may have found it difficult emotionally or in some way because we understand that we shouldn't be making assumptions about people. But if we really thought about what was actually going on in our brains, it was very easy for our brains to provide us with a lot of information about these people that we were looking at for 15 seconds. And that's really, when we're talking about implicit bias, what we're trying to capture is that mechanism that allows our brains to, even with a photograph in 15 seconds, come up with a pretty complex understanding of who we think a person might be and what that person might be like. So one of the reasons that I include, I'm going to go back to the photo here, that I include Mark Zuckerberg in this exercise. So if you don't know, if you didn't recognize him, this is Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg, as the CEO and founder of Facebook, is famous. He is very high status. He's a billionaire. And he runs one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful company, especially tech company, in the entire world and certainly in history. So this is somebody who, if you looked at him and you didn't know that was Mark Zuckerberg, you would have no idea that he's a billionaire founder of one of the most important, powerful companies in the world, because we normally don't associate someone like that with someone that looks like Mark Zuckerberg. So we might say tech has changed that a little bit. And a lot of the founders of technology companies are young, and so maybe our schema has started to change. But the other point here is that knowing that this is Mark Zuckerberg doesn't change how we view all other young men wearing hoodies. We don't suddenly think that all of them are multi-billionaire founders of tech companies. So that point is, there's 2 points there. One is, if we made assumptions without knowing that this was Mark Zuckerberg, we would be wrong about Mark Zuckerberg. But also knowing that Mark Zuckerberg looks like this, and there are many other young men out in the world who look like him, doesn't change what we think about those other young men. So we have a schema, or we have a kind of idea in our heads of what people are like when they wear certain clothes or belong to a certain group. And we don't really update that just because somebody violates our expectations or breaks the mold in some way. Those stereotypes, those kind of prototypes, they're resistant to change. And like this exercise demonstrated, they are very easily accessed in our brains without us having to pay attention or otherwise kind of engage in pulling that information out of our brains. So we might say here that, okay, a lot of people say a photo doesn't tell us a lot. But the reality is that we can still get a lot out of even information that seems even more simple than a photo. So for example, if I gave you a list of names, like the names that are on the screen here, and I asked you the same questions, who is this person? What is this person like? The reality is we could all come up with little stories about what we think a Caitlin or a Sarath or a Robert or a Daryl, what we think those people are like. We might have a guess as to their gender, to their race or ethnicity, to their religion, to their social class, and many other things, maybe their age, etc. So the point is that we can derive a lot of information out of, and our brains provide us with a lot of information that's connected to very simple, seemingly decontextualized information like a name or a photo of a stranger. And further, you could imagine the same exercise with a list of colleges or jobs or occupations, people of different age groups, people of different racial or ethnic groups, people from different countries. So the point is that our brains have all this associated material that once you have one little piece of information, the brain's going to provide you with a cascade of information that's related to help you fill in the gaps. And all of this is because we need to be able to process information really efficiently in the world. And these gap filling exercises that our brain does allows us to do that really efficiently. So we might say then, how is this related to how is this related to bias, cognitive biases and implicit biases? And that's where we can think about how that mechanism that we captured in the first impressions task is a mechanism that we think of in a lot of circumstances as innocuous, meaning that we don't necessarily think that people watching and making up stories about who other people are is a problem. But the way that our brains get in the way is when they take that information and we are making decisions about how to interact with people or affect their lives in ways that are consequential, then suddenly those seemingly innocuous things can have real consequences for other people and for ourselves. So the next phase here is to think about the way our brains get in the way by taking that information from the first impressions task and translating it into things like stereotypes, bias, implicit bias. So I do want to point out here that we're switching interpreters. So if you have Stacy pinned, you may also want to pin Patty, who has just appeared on the screen. She will be taking over at this transition. So I just wanted to note that. Okay, so the ways that our brains get in the way. How is what we were just talking about related to stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and bias? So it's helpful to think about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination and define each of these individually, because people often talk about them almost interchangeably, but it's helpful to understand the distinctions between them so that when we're thinking about what to do about them, how to intervene, how to disrupt them, how to get rid of them, that we understand what it is that we're actually intervening on. So stereotypes are beliefs about certain attributes are characteristic of all members of a particular social group. And importantly, it's helpful to think of stereotypes as something that is cognitive. So it's a thought or a belief that we have in our brains. It's something that can be articulated. I think that this group is like this. And stereotypes can be descriptive, meaning that they describe what people do. So we look out into the world and we say, for example, women are this way, this is how women behave. Or they can be prescriptive, meaning that they can tell us what certain groups or people who have certain identities should and should not be like, or what they should and should not do. So again, gender stereotypes are very helpful here, because we know that we also have a lot of stereotypes about men and women, for example, that say men should behave in this way, women should behave in this way. And there are also ways that we think that both or those two genders should not behave. So stereotypes are those kind of concrete ideas, attitudes, and beliefs that we have about particular social groups. Prejudice, on the other hand, is specifically a negative bias, and it is more affective. That's the word a social scientist like me would use, but it's more about feeling. So do you feel negatively about a particular social group? I mean, we can also have prejudices toward individuals. So the idea is to capture that negative feeling or affect that we might direct at a particular group. It doesn't have to be articulated in the sense of, I feel negatively because of X. So that X might be a stereotype, that X might be an experience of some kind. But a lot of times we experience prejudice as just a liking or disliking of particular groups. So discrimination then is the behavioral part. And that is about the behavior we direct at others and the outcomes that we produce for others. So differential treatment of people from different groups, or the creation of, either intentionally or intentionally, disparate outcomes that for different groups, that's discrimination. And that really is about what are things that are actually affecting people's lives in terms of treatment and outcomes. So again, we tend to think of all of these things as being interchangeable in a way, but what's helpful if we understand that there's a cognitive part, a kind of affective feeling part, and a behavioral part, is that when we look at a situation and say, what do we think is going on here? If we think it's prejudice versus discrimination, we may have a different approach to addressing that problem. The other point is that we don't have to see all of these things show up at the same time. So for example, discrimination can occur without stereotypes or prejudice on the part of the discriminators. So maybe that's because of a systemic discrimination, so something that's built into a system. In addition, just because we hold stereotypes about particular groups or prejudice about particular groups doesn't mean we will automatically discriminate. So we also want to understand that while these things may co-occur, they're not destined to always co-occur. So we want to be mindful of, when we're talking about these challenges, trying to our best to identify which one of these things we think we're actually addressing. So what is bias? then as it relates to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, prejudice is a negative bias. So that means that if we want to do a more general definition of bias, then we want to expand our definition to understand that it's deviation from neutral. It's a feeling in favor of or against a person, a group, a thing, anything we can form an attitude about. And so that means that it helps us to think not only about prejudice, but also about the many ways that we can have positive biases or preferences towards things that can create outcomes that lead to disparity and that lead to differential treatment, even if what's motivating that is something positive. So there's power in naming. And so once we understand that biases can be positive or negative in direction, once we call it a bias, then people understand that's at least something that we should take a closer look at and be mindful of. And biases aren't inherently good or bad. We have all kinds of biases that are based on all kinds of things, and we have plenty of biases that probably in most circumstances are innocuous. But there are often times when the biases, the assumptions, the expectations that we have can lead to less than ideal outcomes, if not outright disparities. And so that's when we want to be mindful. It's also helpful to think about bias in a broader sense beyond social identity biases, to think about cognitive biases more broadly and the way that various ways, including stereotypes, but not limited to stereotypes, that our brains take shortcuts to help us process information efficiently. So this handout, and don't worry that you can't see the details of it, this handout is just to demonstrate that you can identify, you could 20 different cognitive biases that have the potential to screw up your decision making. And I'm happy to share this, and Heidi can post this on the League of Women Voters website for you to access at a later point. But the point here is that these biases don't necessarily implicate social identity, but they are things that can screw up our decisions, that can bias our decisions in ways that produce differential treatment, produce disparities, and create problems in terms of our decision making. So I'm going to call a couple of these things out specifically so that we can get a better sense of the types of things that are captured on that sheet. So when thinking about bias, in my view, the most important bias to be aware of is the blind spot bias. And that is a bias that we have to be blind to our own biases. So the bias blind spot is operating when we think we're always being objective and rational, but we understand that other people are biased. So that is one thing about the blind spot, is that the blind spot only applies to us as individuals. When I think about myself, I'm blind to my own biases. It does not mean that I'm blind to others. And in fact, we are quite good at recognizing the biases of others at the same time that we have a hard time recognizing them for ourselves. And this really comes down to wanting to feel good about ourselves, wanting to think that we're being the best version of ourselves. And there's a whole host of biases that fall into this category of self-serving, self-affirming, ego-affirming biases that make us feel like we are being the best version of ourselves, and to some extent that we might even be better than others are at certain things, like being bias-free. So overconfidence is another bias that's in that category of biases that are related to making us feel good about ourselves. So overconfidence comes into play when we feel confident in a particular domain, when we feel like I really am an expert, I really know how to do this thing. And so that overconfidence can lead to a bias wherein we don't pay as much attention as we should, or we're not as thoughtful or careful as we should be. And that can lead to unforced errors or problems that, had we not been overconfident, we would have avoided. And that too is really related to the idea that we want to feel good about ourselves and want to think we're great in so many ways. And this is a way to kind of prop up our sense of self and our egos. So there's another category of biases then That's really, you may have heard the language of heuristics, so cognitive shortcuts or heuristics. And these are really biases that are related to information processing. So the confirmation bias is a classic information processing bias whereby once we have decided what we think about a particular issue or a person, for example, then we only want information that confirms whatever it is we already believe to be true. So I'll use the example of a police detective who has identified a suspect in a case. So once that suspect has been identified, that detective is likely, due to the confirmation bias, that detective is likely to only want evidence that supports that their suspect is the correct one, and they're likely to dismiss evidence that challenges that assumption in any way. And so we can also see this operate, for example, in the polarization of news. So when we look at people's Facebook feeds, as we click yes or no or like or don't like on various things, that creates a situation where we are creating ever more polarized views of the news because we are continually seeking information that confirms what we already believe to be true, while we're also more likely to dismiss information that challenges our existing viewpoint in any way. So there's a whole host of biases that are about that type of information processing, the ways that we take shortcuts, that we use or don't use certain information, that we seek or don't seek certain information, so that we can be efficient, but also potentially prop up existing viewpoints of ours from threats from conflicting evidence. So stereotyping then is under the umbrella of cognitive biases. So when we think about bias, we often go directly to stereotyping, and we think only about social identity biases, but we should really be thinking about this broader category of biases that can affect our decision making, because all of them have the potential to have an influence and to interact with one another in ways that then produce the bad outcomes that we're concerned about when we're concerned about bias. So then we might say, and as a last kind of piece here about what is bias, what is implicit bias? So I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase before. And the basic idea of implicit bias comes from the theory that we basically have two cognitive pathways through the brain. One is very conscious and deliberative, and that is the top line of this diagram. And so the idea here is that there's some kind of input. Maybe we have a dilemma or we have a decision to make, and then we engage in deliberative processing. We go and we get opinions, we seek information, we weigh that information, and then we come to a conclusion and we make a decision. So that is the slow part of our brains, but it's also the one that's the most salient to us because it's the one we're aware of. So as adults and as professionals, when we think about thinking, we are thinking about that process, that deliberative, conscious process where we're weighing information and actively trying to make a decision. Implicit bias comes from this bottom line on this diagram, the automatic processing. And this system is fast. It doesn't require attention. It doesn't require any motivation. It's just on all the time, and it allows us to process information really quickly. So that first impressions task that we started with, the stuff that your brain was giving you that allowed you in 15 seconds to say what this person's gender was, what job you thought they had, whether you thought they were a nice person or not, that is coming out of the automatic fast system. Now, lots of people ask, what's the relationship between these two? And I think it's helpful to point out that in the deliberative system, part of what bias interruption is about is shining a light on the automatic system. And when you notice something, when there's a red flag as to something problematic coming out of that process, that you pop it up into that more deliberative system so that you can pay attention and you can decide, is this something that I actually want to be using to make my decision? And on the deliberative side, we all have the experience of something starting very deliberate and then becoming more automatic over time. So I always use the example of when we move to a new place, a new house, and we have to go to work. When we first move, we have to be very deliberate about how do we get from home to work. So we have to think, oh, I need to take this turn. I need to turn on this street. I need to drive this many miles. But eventually, and usually doesn't take very long, eventually you can drive home from work or to and from work without much thought at all, because you've automated the process of thinking about that route. And so that's something that you can do relatively automatically. So what's important to understand here is that these two are not exclusive. They interact with one another, and bias interruption is really about interrupting what's happening at that automatic level so that you can be more attentive to it and disrupt it if it's problematic. So I will point out that if you're interested in learning more about implicit associations or implicit bias specifically, there is a task if you go to this website here, projectimplicit.com, that measures various types of associations, those automatic associations that your brain has, and will give you some feedback on those associations. So you can look at things like the association between gender and art versus science, or between positive and negative feelings about presidential candidates. So there's a variety of ones that you can do. And what's important here is that this is the primary research measurement that has been used in research. And now, after thousands of administrations, tens of thousands of administrations, we know that it's capturing something at the implicit automatic level, what our brain automatically provides to us and quickly provides to us, that affects hiring, firing, promotion, evaluations, and all kinds of employment decisions. It affects interpersonal interactions and through things like liking and comfort or willingness to be close to others. And it also affects how we allocate resources and opportunities, among other things. So we know at this point from the research that there is a big impact of those automatic things that our brain is providing to us. So at this point, what I'd like to do is have us kind of think about these different types of biases that we've been talking about and how they might explain what's going on in a particular situation. Because part of the value of kind of complicating how we understand bias is that it gives us a more nuanced language for understanding how to explain and then how to intervene in a situation where we think there's a bias or where we think there's a disparity of some kind. So I'm going to describe to you a little study that was done a few years ago, and then I'd like you to take a moment to process that, and you can respond in the chat box about the question that I ask you at the end. So the study was a set of researchers drafted a legal research memo. So this is a common document that a new lawyer might be asked in a law firm to write for a senior lawyer. So a memo where they might say, what's the existing law on this issue or that issue? So the researchers drafted one of these legal memos, and they gave the memo writer, they said there was a memo writer, a lawyer, who was ostensibly a third-year lawyer in a law firm. His name, they gave him a name. They gave him a set of credentials. So they said, for example, that he went to NYU Law School. And they identified whether the writer of the memo was either white or black. So half of the evaluators believed that the writer was black, and half of the evaluators believed that the writer was white. So everything else was held the same. So the name was the same, that the credentials were the same, and the actual memo itself was the same. So what happened was that when they got the responses back from the evaluators, who were all lawyers who worked in law firms, who would be those supervising younger attorneys, like the one that supposedly wrote the memo, what they found was that the black memos were rated below the white memos. So on a scale of 1 to 5, the black memos were rated a 3 out of 5, the white memos a 4 out of 5. There were twice as many errors found in the black memo compared to the white memo. So what's important here is that there were no different number of errors. It was exactly the same memo. So for example, in the category of spelling and grammatical errors, 6 of the 7 errors were found in the black memo, while only 3 of the 7 were found in the white memo. There was 3 times as much unsolicited feedback on the black memo compared to the white memo. And I say unsolicited because this was feedback that was not requested by the researchers. So the responding attorneys were more likely to give additional criticism of the memo for the black writer versus the white writer. And when they asked the attorneys who were evaluating the memo to describe the memo and or the writer, the black memo and writer got feedback like, it needs a lot of work, can't believe he went to NYU, average at best, while the white memo and writer got feedback like, generally good but needs work, has potential, good analytical skills. Now, of course, what's important here is that everybody was reading the same memo. The only difference was whether they believed that Thomas, who wrote the memo, was black or that Thomas was white. So the question that I have for you, given what we've talked about in terms of these different types of biases, is why might this happen? So think about the different types of biases that we've already discussed tonight, and you can drop it in the chat box, ideas that you have about why this might happen. So I'm going to pause here and give you a couple of moments to respond. You can respond to either everybody or to just me, Destiny Peary. Great. So we have some responses coming in now. Okay. So I'm going to work through some of these because we have some overlap here. So why might this happen? So we might have this happen because some of the evaluators believe that the person of color, so the black Thomas, is lesser in some way or needs more help than the white Thomas. And that is very much related to the idea of stereotyping or bias, right? So the idea that there might be stereotypes generally that people believe about the black lawyer versus the white lawyer. We have the point that there might be more desire to be critical of a black writer or the black memo. And that very much relates to the idea that confirmation bias might be at play. So if we think, for example, that a writer of a particular group is less likely to be a good writer, then we're going to be more likely to look for errors in that memo than we are for somebody who we assume will be a good writer. So we have a lot of that. We have the point that this may operate implicitly or explicitly. So someone may hold that perspective at an implicit level based on exposure to the world around us, and maybe those ideas are floating out there and we've picked them up, maybe even internalize them. Or someone may actually say, I believe that black lawyers are less good writers than white lawyers. Someone pointed out that most of the lawyers evaluating the memo were probably white, which they were. And so they may have identified more with the white memo writer, which has consequences potentially in a positive bias way of leading them to give that white writer the benefit of the doubt, to be less critical, etc. Let's see. So we have a lot of responses that are about stereotypes. Okay. Just want to make sure I don't miss anything here. These are all great. Okay. So you all really captured it well, and I know even those of you who didn't respond, that I know that you got this. So why might this happen? previous research by the same researchers had shown that attorneys were more likely to believe that Black lawyers were less good writers. So there was an existing stereotype in law firms that the Black lawyers were less good writers, which means that, for example, somebody could have been exposed to that stereotype and it operates implicitly, and so their brain automatically does that. Or it could be explicit, as in somebody says, I think that Black lawyers are less good than white lawyers. So that's the explicit implicit bias divide. Then you have the confirmation bias, which many of you in the chat mentioned, which is once you have that attitude or belief, then you begin to make decisions about how much attention you pay to the memo, whether you're seeing errors or not seeing errors, whether you give someone the benefit of the doubt based on that underlying attitude. So we seek information that confirms what we believe to be true. But I do want to point out one thing that also can produce the same outcome, even though the motivation is not necessarily bias in the negative sense. And this, I discovered this because I was presenting to a group of lawyers, and a Black woman, a senior Black woman lawyer who was a partner in her law firm, stood up in front of a room of hundreds of people and said, I think I've been doing this to all of the women and the people of color I supervise. And what she meant was that she was giving them extra attention, and she was making sure they got a lot more feedback, that all of the feedback she gave them was really, really detailed, because she wanted to make sure that they were getting all of the feedback they needed so they could present themselves well to everybody else. But what she didn't realize is that she was treating the white male attorneys she supervised differently than the women and the people of color, and she hadn't thought about how they might perceive those things differently, or how they might receive that she's responding to them in these different ways. So what's important here is that even when we have good intentions, that can create a circumstance where we produce a disparity that we didn't intend, and that is in no way in alignment with our good intentions, but is a disparity nonetheless. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any additional questions related to this exercise before moving to the next section. Okay, so the next piece that I want to talk about is, this is a good time to point that we're going to be switching translators again. So if you don't currently have Stacy pinned, Stacy has just joined us, and Patty will be transitioning off. So Stacy and Patty are two translators. So if you are using the interpreters, then those are the two to pay attention to. So the next piece here that I want to talk about is how implicit bias can manifest in interactions and relationships. And so I want to talk about a couple of pieces here, and that is, I mean, these are not the only ways, but there's some important ways to think about how we might carry certain biases, assumptions, stereotypes, etc., into our interactions, and that has consequences. So one piece is that we tend to respond negatively to people who do not conform to our expectations, whatever they happen to be. And this can be, but is not entirely related to stereotypes, but a good way to demonstrate this is through gender stereotypes. So as we mentioned before, stereotypes can be both descriptive and prescriptive. And I mentioned before also that gender stereotypes are a very good way of understanding the idea that we have stereotypes that say this is how men and women are, but also this is how men and women should be. And so what happens when, for example, men or women or non-binary people who are just saying, we don't want to fall into either of these categories, don't conform to people's expectations about gender, then that can create backlash. So that can lead to negative reactions to that person, negative evaluations of that person, negative behaviors toward that person. And it relates to the idea that, one, we like to feel like we're right, but also we are uncomfortable as humans generally with the idea that what we expect to get out of somebody isn't what we actually got. So we want to be mindful when we have situations where we encounter a person and our reaction to them is kind of surprise or frustration that they're not how we expected them to be. And this can occur even when they're more positive than expected, because it's the violation of our expectation that is initially jarring. There's also been a lot of research on anxiety in interactions, and particularly intergroup interactions, meaning interactions between people who belong to different social identity groups. And what's important to understand here is that anxiety in these interactions disrupts our ability to be relaxed, to be personable, and to otherwise do things that will make us be perceived as friendly. And this means that we're likely, when we're anxious, to be perceived in a more negative light, and even can create a situation where the person who's anxious about making a good impression appears more biased than they actually are. The other thing that is that comes up with respect to anxiety and interactions is that the person experiencing the anxiety may also form a negative impression of the person they feel is creating the anxiety. So for example, if I'm interacting with someone of a different group and I'm anxious about it, I may attribute them as the cause of that anxiety and thus feel more negatively toward them. So it can go, that anxiety and the negative consequences of anxiety can go in both directions. And interesting, a lot of research has shown that it's often people who are more committed to egalitarian or equal attitudes that are more likely to be anxious, because they're more concerned about making a good impression and having these interactions across social identity lines go well. So it's the very people who are most concerned and who have the attitudes that are most supportive of diversity and inclusion that might fall prey to the downsides of anxiety. And this is very much related to the idea of stereotype threat, because a lot of times the anxiety is created by a concern that there is a stereotype about a group that we belong to, and that we are going to inadvertently affirm that stereotype. So a lot of the research here has been done on students in academic environments. They look at, for example, women in math, and they say, like, there's a stereotype that men or boys are better at math than girls or women. So when women are in those spaces, they know there's a stereotype that they're less good at math. And when they're aware of that stereotype, then it can make them perform less well, which can confirm the stereotype. And so this idea of kind of a concern can interfere with performance. It can stress people out, make them anxious. It can make them less likely to want to be in that space or doing that work, make them less resilient in the face of frustrations or challenges. And so we want to be aware of the way that we are ultimately super concerned with the way others perceive us. And we want to be mindful of how anxiety plays a role, our own anxiety and that of the person we're interacting with plays a role in how that interaction might go. And the other piece to mention here in terms of how implicit bias can manifest in relationships is in the form of microaggressions. So microaggressions is really an umbrella term that describes a lot of different things that are considered more subtle than physical assault. That's why it's called microaggression, as opposed to a physical aggression. But the two main types that are typically talked about are called micro insults and micro invalidations. So micro insults are maybe non-conscious or unintentional, but not always. And they're generally considered to be rude, insensitive, or inconsiderate comments that say something about someone's identity. So for example, backhanded compliments. So for example, a Black person is lauded as being so articulate, or confusing a Latinx coworker for a maintenance worker. So these are things that are really, that reveal something about one's assumptions about how a Black person should speak or what job a Latinx person might have. And a comment about that or a confusion in that way is rude and insensitive, even if not intentional. And then there's also micro invalidations, which are minimizations of psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiences based on one's identity. So here you see, for example, the dismissal of people's experiences as micro invalidations. So when someone says, this thing happened to me, or I was discriminated against, and someone says, oh, you're just being oversensitive, or that didn't happen to you, those types of things also are ways that people can feel like they're being minimized or they're being treated differently because of something about their identity. So these are all examples of ways that implicit biases of various kinds can creep into our interpersonal relationships as much as they can our decision making. So we talked about decisions a lot up front, but but in many ways these relational pieces are much more subtle and can have much more consequence for our day-to-day lives than a lot of the big decisions that we might be thinking about as potentially being subject to bias. So at this point, we would like to give you an opportunity to discuss and process what we've been talking about here. So the simple prompt here, when you go into your discussion groups, is what could you be doing, whether that's based on what we've talked about here today or other ideas that you have, what could you be doing to address these types of potential barriers to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So that's it. That's the prompt. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms, and we'll broadcast the prompt in case you forget it. And we're just going to give you 15 minutes or so to discuss with the folks in your group the ideas that you have or your reactions to this presentation. We will then come back together to this main room and do a wrap up. So make sure you don't sign off at the end of the breakout sessions. And the other reminder here is that as you go into the breakout rooms, you should feel free at that point to turn on your camera and your audio, your microphone, so that you can actually see and interact with the people in your room. I see Heidi has come back, so I want to make sure, see if she has any other announcements here.
Just a couple of people, we had to turn off their video so that we ensured that the interpreter was being seen clearly, and those people will have a difficult time turning their own videos back on, but we've tried to keep track of who those people are so that you may get a message saying, please start your videos. So that's us trying to manage that piece of the technology. And thank you for your patience as we are all trying to manage technology as volunteers. That's a little beyond us.
So at this point, you'll get an invitation to join a breakout room, and then we will call you back in about 15 minutes or so.
And also, if you need an ASL interpreter, you must let us know so that we can put you in a room with that interpreter. Otherwise, we're doing random. This is cerebral. I don't know what I was expecting, but. So does that mean, Regan, that these people who are still here they have not joined their breakout rooms?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That always happens in my experience.
At the national convention, there was like 1,000 of us on this meeting. It became sort of a joke the number of times they were like, you must mute.
Yeah. I think people are getting better with time, though.
I mean, you can't expect people to just automatically figure this stuff out. And for somebody, for like Regan and these younger people who they've never had life without technology.
Right.
I was the only person on my entire floor in college who had a computer. And the only thing I did with it was type. I mean, I used it like a typewriter. I didn't really do anything with it.
Yeah.
I hated it.
Well, you couldn't do much with it back then.
No, but my dad gave it to me. I was like, I'm on a trip. I don't want this computer. I was really snotty about it. So anyway, but I was definitely biased about nerds. I think, though, part of the thing, though, when you see the chat, there is bias just in this group, right? That this confirmation bias, right? There's the people maybe that we need to actually reach with something like this don't come to something like this.
Right. That's always the challenge of this work.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I try to think about is we have an amazing environmental team led by some amazing women. And one of the things one of our leaders told me one time, she said, the climate change deniers don't even bother. You're not going to change their minds. What you have to do is you have to find those people who believe that climate change is a thing, but haven't actually done anything about it.
Right.
That's where I see us in this space.
Right.
There are people who know that racism is a problem, bias is a problem, but they've not actually done anything. So let's see if we can get them to do something.
Or they're still persuadable. Because, if someone's really anchored on a particular viewpoint, and, you could have extremes on both ends of any issue, you're not going to change those people's minds. So my approach is always that I'm not trying to get to the hardest, most resistant person in the room.
Right.
Because that often is futile. And, and a lot of times when someone who is so entrenched knows you're trying to change their mind, it only serves to make them more entrenched. But you can often, wiggle your way in there.
Yeah.
In a more subtle way, if it doesn't seem like you're going after them. And so I think that's really important too.
And I think that we've heard that response from people who came to our other two programs. They said they didn't feel like we were trying to shame them, that we were just trying to say, here, this is someone who happens to be a person of color living in our community, and this is their actual story.
Right.
It's hard to argue with that.
That's right. That's right.
So anyway, we're doing our best.
Yeah.
I think your presentation is amazing.
Well, I appreciate that. It's definitely been, it's getting feedback from various audiences has, I think, really helped me figure out what's the right way to convey this so that people get it and they engage, and it's not threatening. Like we might be uncomfortable, but it's different to be uncomfortable than it is to be threatened. Mm-hmm. And I try to avoid that so people don't shut down.
I think I'm a very threatening person. I don't mean to be, but I am. So that's something for me to remember.
I always talk a lot with my students about strategy, that sometimes they feel like, if you really care about something, then the approach shouldn't matter. And I said, well, if you really want to get things done, a lot of times you have to think about, what's going to resonate? How do I reach this group? How do I move the needle on this issue? And that it's not really compromise as much as it is being strategic as possible about how one approaches people or an issue so that they're more likely to get an outcome that they want. And, that's a struggle because I think in any movement or activist space, that's an eternal struggle. It's kind of what's the right way to go about something.
Right. Well, and I argued with several people, like when it comes especially to the suffrage movement, and I think the civil rights movement, and I think that, you know, historians could probably argue this till they're blue in the face, but I believe that both of those movements were only successful because the peaceful protesters were foiled by far more, violence not the word I want to go for, but intense. I don't know that Martin Luther King would have gotten where he got without Malcolm X.
Right.
I don't think the suffragettes would have, you know, if they didn't have some of those women, you know, willing to go to jail and starve themselves, I don't think that the ones who were more ladylike would have ended up getting the results that they got.
So there's a law professor, his name's Randall Kennedy, and he's written a lot about the civil rights movement. And he gave a talk when I was at Duke. And one of the things that really, and this was years ago, that really stuck with me was him talking about in movements how the backlash is often really critical to moving the needle forward faster. So and this relates to the idea that you need a strategy that's going to push hard enough, maybe even so that it creates backlash, because that can mobilize and get people on board that maybe wouldn't have been on board before. And so even if it feels like you're taking a step back or two steps back, it can propel you forward faster if there is this kind of more extreme back and forth. And that kind of gets to your idea of, like, if it's too moderate a strategy, it either doesn't feel pressing for the people who are being pushed on, and it doesn't motivate enough folks to move behind it. And so I always thought that was a really interesting way to think about the kind of back and forth on issues. Is the backlash can actually be helpful. It's painful, but it can be helpful in the end. And that usually comes from some element that is more radical, or that's pushing harder or asking for more, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this whole country was founded on, you know,
exactly.
big old protest.
Right, exactly.
We like a boycott, like
a revolution, yeah.
But then, you know, I like to, you know, people tend to forget that it wasn't, you know, it wasn't necessarily equality for everybody. It was equality for my people, equality for my religion.
That's been the eternal fight, I think, in the U.S. story, for sure.
So,
I'm not sure who actually set up the breakout rooms.
Regan did.
That was me, yeah.
Do you want to call, you know, like start pulling people back at like 8:18?
Sure, I'll give them a 4-minute warning.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
We're learning a lot. So we learned, so you have to be a host of the meeting.
Right.
To be able to broadcast it.
Right.
Like onto another channel. So, and you have to be a host of the meeting, not a co-host, but a host to do the breakout rooms.
Okay.
But we learned that you can pass the host.
You can move it around, yeah.
Yeah, without messing up like your feed, or that was what we were afraid of. We're like, what if we, but Emily's like, there's only 2 people watching on Facebook. So it screws it up.
It's okay.
Okay. So, of course, right now, this whole discussion, I guess, is probably being broadcast. Yes, we're live on Facebook.
It's okay.
It's okay. I haven't said anything I regret.
So I'll talk a little bit about what my take on what can be done, and then Q&A, and then I'll turn back to you, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and, you know, shut my my video and my audio back off and ask everybody when we come back to also shut their, so Regan, if you would send that broadcast that as they come back, we're going to ask them to mute and turn off their cameras again.
I will.
So that we can see because that happened to us in our last two. So we, invested in having the programs interpreted, and I think it was fine during the event, but then the recording, you don't see the interpreter.
I see. Okay.
So, but you're not going to learn unless you just jump in and do it.
That's right. We're all in that phase right now, for sure.
So it's a little scary. I think I scare my league sometimes. Now, the next 3 programs that we're going to be doing, our plan is the intersection of environmental and racial justice.
Ooh, great.
I got a call from Viter House of Hospitality and Bethany House, and they help refugees, young adult refugees on the immigration jungle. And then we're hoping to have a program on voter suppression. And again, hear those stories about how, like, it is in our backyard.
Right.
I think Illinois is pretty good when it comes.
Right.
I don't think that we have the voter suppression that a lot of other states do, but I still think it exists.
Yes, I agree.
So I'll go ahead and turn off my video. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close these rooms.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, welcome back, folks. As you return, we're going to ask you again if you don't mind turning off your video so that we can make sure we can see the interpreters for the last portion here. And if you're just returning, just a reminder again to turn off your video so we'll be sure to see the interpreters.
No.
Okay. So as we, it looks like most people are back. So just one final reminder, if you can turn off your video so that we can make sure everyone can see the interpreter. So I wanted to close. Normally I would have loved to have been able to hear from all of you about what you discussed in your groups, but I hope that you had a productive conversation and that it will be this will be part of a continuing conversation, not only in terms of your engagement with the League of Women Voters and the programming that has already happened, and also that which is coming, but also in your communities and in your homes and in your spaces outside of this space, that you can, continue or begin to have some of these conversations with those around you. So I wanted to close with some of my own thoughts about what can be done and some things to be thinking about, and then there will be a time for Q&A. So in terms of what can be done, I think I kind of shed light on this when I said that I thought the most important bias to get past was the blind spot bias. And really the most important thing is really to be aware and acknowledge the potential for bias. And it can be uncomfortable and even potentially threatening for us to admit that we all have biases, but we do. And the goal is not really to not be biased, because humans are really wired to be biased, whether we like it or not. So the idea is to get past our blind spots, to really acknowledge the potential for bias, and to begin to ask questions of ourselves and others and the organizations and the systems and the institutions around us in ways that will help reveal some of those biases, assumptions, and expectations so that we can do something about them. And that means paying attention, looking for patterns, collecting data if it makes sense, but also engage instead of backing away from situations where you find yourself surprised or uncomfortable, because those are learning opportunities that reveal underlying assumptions and expectations and biases that you might have that you can then grapple with in ways that you wouldn't have appreciated or noticed before. If we're thinking about our own decision-making as well as that of organizations or institutions we might play a role in, we want to think about increased accountability and transparency, because better managed discretion, providing guardrails for people to make decisions in a productive way that are in ways that are less biased, usually means not just letting people make decisions any which way based on whatever they want to make decisions on, but in ways that are managed and that have proper guidelines and guardrails for that decision making. And a lot of that has to do with thinking about ways that a process, whether it's our own decision-making process or an organization's process, can consider and control for potential biases. So that means building in checks on decision-making, having opportunities for multiple people to review, having reporting procedures that require reasons to be articulated, and again, asking questions. So asking questions requires us to articulate answers, and having to do that when we're not accustomed to do it really reveals a lot about what is underlying our decision-making, our perceptions, and our behavior towards others. And last but not least, incorporation of diverse perspectives and people. And I want to highlight the word incorporation because it really is about making sure that you have people in the room who feel like they can participate and who really have an opportunity to have a voice in whatever is going on, as opposed to just being there to be counted. So we want to make sure diversity of various kinds is represented, but that it's also an integral part of what goes on in a particular space. So those are just some of my closing thoughts. I see a couple of questions here. Will you be sharing your slide deck following the presentation? I will give that to Heidi and she will make that available on the website, as well as the 20 cognitive biases handout. And so you'll be able to find those there. And then if you do have questions, now is the time to submit them. So another person wrote that Ibram Kendi writes that he no longer uses the term microaggression, but simply calls it racist abuse. Is it a stronger term, perhaps closer? Is this stronger term perhaps closer to reality? I haven't really thought about that, to be honest, but I think the term microaggression is confusing to people. So no matter what, I do think we're using the term because that's what researchers identified it, and that's the term that kind of first labeled what it is that we are talking about. But it is probably true, whether we think racist abuse is the correct term or not, that we probably need better terminology for that. I have another question here. Does the use of rubrics reduce bias in decision making? So this question really relates to increasing accountability and transparency. So if you have a rubric, if you set criteria in advance of your decision making, that provides a guardrail that provides a guideline for the decision making that makes it harder for people to deviate off in ways that might be biased or not entirely relevant to the decision making. So there's some research, for example, on shifting criteria, which is always something to be on the lookout for, that shows that even when people set criteria in advance, you have to be mindful of the ways that people's preferences and biases might begin to move that criteria around. But the helpful point is that you have a starting point that everyone who's involved in the decision-making process agrees on as the relevant criteria for making a selection or making a decision. And then you do the best you can to adhere to that. And that is going to do a lot to increase not only accountability and transparency in the process, but will also mean that people have some kind of guardrail for their decision making. They're not supposed to be making decisions on the basis of anything that they want. They're supposed to be focused on the criteria. There's another question here. How can we ask questions to gain understanding if some people automatically regard it as a microaggression? So I think this is a really important question, because a lot of times if we go back to the discussion about anxiety, that a lot of these intergroup interactions or interactions around these issues are fraught. And they're fraught sometimes in anticipation, so people expect them to be difficult, or there are people don't respond positively, or they have a negative experience. And that means that can lead to a negative interaction. So if someone says that you have committed a microaggression, and maybe that's because you've asked a question that they don't like, then part of that is just to, one, give each other space, give each other the benefit of the doubt of good intentions, and continue to engage if possible. I think when I say ask questions, I mean that more of asking of ourselves or asking about systems or processes, and maybe a little bit less about asking other people to explain things to us. Because I think that's where we get into trouble, when we want other people to do work that we could be doing ourselves, especially given the kind of availability of resources, books and movies and podcasts and TED Talks, and all kinds of things that we can easily find on the internet to better understand, and then approaching conversations about these topics in a way that's not about somebody needing to, give us information. So I think, we do have to kind of be gentle with ourselves, and as best as we can be gentle with others. And I know that doesn't always happen, but it's to try to figure, if somebody says, I don't like how you asked that question, or that you asked that question, trying to get a sense of why, and engaging there is the path forward, as opposed to backing away from that or shutting down. So that's not always easy work to do, but it's necessary work. Another question, how would you suggest we start breaking down and challenging our own biases? So I think here, those paying attention, asking questions, getting practiced at noticing when things come to mind. So I often tell a story about my own experience where I had formed a negative, I did not like a neighbor that I had a few years ago. And I didn't realize, although if you'd asked me as a social scientist, I would have said, of course, that I had formed a bias against her. And I realized this when I went to a store and I ran into a woman. I crossed paths with a woman who looked like her. And my immediate reaction to her was, I hate this person. And it was because she reminded me of my neighbor. So there was nothing I could do necessarily to stop that bias from forming, but I had enough of self-awareness to notice that thought came to mind and to engage that for myself. Like, there was no way I was affecting this other woman, but I caught myself and I thought, like, ooh, Destiny, that's not good. And let's think about that. And that is really powerful, to be able to ask ourselves those questions, to catch ourselves in those moments, and to really engage with ourselves about, why am I feeling this way, reacting this way to this person, what's behind that, etc. So someone said, our group struggled with having good intentions and wanting to help. So academically, groups who historically have poor outcomes. So how do we relate to the idea that there's basically data out there that supports certain stereotypes? And how do we grapple with the fact that there might be situations out in the world that reflect stereotypes, but we don't want to stereotype? And I think that really is the kernel truth idea, or what is called statistical discrimination. And that is, we can look out in the world and say, you know, Black students, for example, on average, achieve less than white students. And so that's just a fact that's captured by certain data points. But what's important is to say, well, why is that? And if our answer is that there's something wrong with the Black students, and that's our only answer, then that's stereotyping, because that's saying, well, they achieve less because they are less smart, or they're less competent, or they're less focused, or they're lazy, or any of the stereotypes we might think about. So instead, if we say, okay, there's a statistical reality that Black students on average achieve less than white students, if we say, why is that, and we start to look for explanations that go beyond the deficits, the perceived deficits of the group, that's how we can manage this idea of acknowledging statistical real facts about the world without falling prey to stereotypes as an explanation for those facts of the world. And then somebody posted a video on how to respond when you're called out for a microaggression. So I think that is the end of our questions. So I really appreciate you taking the time tonight. We took prime time to, you skipped whatever good television shows or what have you that you may have wanted to be watching to be with us tonight, and we appreciate that. And again, we'll make resources available on the website. And if you have additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If you email me, I'll drop my email in the chat. And Heidi has a couple of announcements here.
So before we leave, we're going to throw up a quick poll that will help us be a better ally to all of you, our community. And I just wanted, while you guys are helping us by answering these poll questions, I just want to thank a couple of people. First, no event ever goes off without a lot of support behind the scenes. So the Reverend Clyde Brooks of the Illinois Commission on Diversity and Human Relations has been an amazing mentor to our league and to me personally. Regan Graham stepped in to offer her expertise on remote meetings. Emily Lasky expertly manages our social media. Aaron McDermott helped us as we tried for the first time to do closed captioning. Community Consolidated School District 21 underwrote tonight's program. The Buffalo Grove Community Trust supported the ASL interpreters, and our board of directors, the League of Women Voters of Arlington Heights, Mount Prospect, and Buffalo Grove, they have unflinchingly supported this Anger to Action series. And I am especially grateful to the three people that have been on screen, our ASL interpreter, Stacy Shine Stapleton, and Patty Shore Caden, and of course, our facilitator, Dr. Destiny Peary. Our programs are free and open to the public. I thought that we were going to have to charge for this program, and we haven't had to charge for a program except if it were a fundraiser in a very long time. So I was very grateful to District 21 for that, and also some private donors as well. But these programs are not free for us to put on, so we always need donations. We give every student in District 214 a gift when they turn old enough to vote. That's 3,500 gifts that we hand out every year. We put on candidates forums, voter registration drives. We're going to hit over 6,000 homes this fall, going door to door, encouraging people to vote. So consider joining us or donating at www.lwvah.org and help us continue to provide these services. We have 3 more programs in our Anger to Action series planned for this fall. We're going to be doing a program on the intersection of environmental and racial justice. We are also going to be co-hosting a program with Viator House of Hospitality and the Bethany House on the immigration jungle. And we plan to have a program on voter suppression in our backyard. So together, we continue to make sure that our community is one that all of these communities that we represent is one that values and demands diversity, equity, and inclusion for all. Finally, I told you that I like prizes. I really do like a prize. If you post your story about how you did one of these things that Dr. Pirie has told you, the action that you can actually do, if you post that story on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and you tag us on social media, we will have a drawing to win 2 tickets for this October's 52nd annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Remembrance Dinner and Concert, planned for October 24th, and featuring 5 Blind Boys of Alabama. I am really looking forward to being able to get out and dance and get dressed up. And then 2 other lucky storytellers will win one of our vote masks that are currently on sale through our website. So that is it for us tonight, and thank you so much. We will be posting this particular program. You can tell your friends. It will be posted. It's being currently live streamed on Facebook and will be available on Facebook soon, and then on YouTube and our website. We cannot thank Dr. Pirie enough for her generosity. Most facilitators would not allow that. And so that shows her commitment to making sure that people hear this message. One of the things that Dr. Pirie and I talked about while the rest of you were on in the breakout room is that this work is uncomfortable, right? It's going to be uncomfortable. But together, if we're all willing to be a little uncomfortable, we're going to make great strides. So thank you so much.